So welcome everyone to the next series of our Ask the Expert, and today I am joined by the wonderful and gorgeous Caroline Strawson. So welcome.
And thank you. Thank you. I'm not sure about gorgeous. I was just saying my roots are desperately needing to be doing, but thank you for that. I'll take it at the moment, definitely.
Oh, bless you. No, still gorgeous and radiant. So Caroline, it would be amazing if you could just give us a bit of an insight into kind of a little bit about who you are and sort of share us, you know, a little bit about how you got to where you got to today and how you can help people from a personal or professional perspective in what you do.
So it's really lovely. Thank you so much for inviting me to come on. It's a real pleasure to be here. So as you mentioned, my name is Caroline Strawson and I'm a therapist and a coach. So I'm not just one or the other. I dip into therapy and I'm also a coach as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about too. So really what brought me to where I am today was a lot of my own personal experiences. I do have a medical background, but sort of 10, 11 years ago, I really had about 18 months of really major trauma in my life when I look back. So my mum passed away very, very suddenly. My husband left me and my two children. And in that time, I found out we were in over £70,000 worth of debt in total, of which 23,000 was in my name on my own. And I was diagnosed with complex PTSD, depression, anxiety and self-harm at that time, because I realised I'd been in an abusive relationship, a psychologically or narcissistically abusive relationship, of which I didn't know at the time. I had become a real shell of myself. And you know, many people who've known me from many, many years ago, you know, I always looked like I was a confident, ambitious woman. And I really lost myself. I came out of that marriage literally, the only word I can describe it is broken in some respects. I was literally at rock bottom. And really for a number of years following that, you know, it was only my children really that were my main focus. And I've always said if I didn't have my children, I had some very dark thoughts. I probably wouldn't even be here today. So it was really my two children that got me through that time. And during that time, really, I was desperately not wanting to feel the way I was, but I was just filled with a lot of hurt, anger, shame, guilt. Here I was now as a single mother, you know, my kids were from a broken home. And, you know, I'd been brought up on ladybird books, you know, happily ever afters. And for me at that time, then it was like, oh my God, you know, what has my life become? It wasn't what I set it out to be. And what I didn't realize was that obviously when you've been in an abusive relationship as well, you have so many changes, lots of physiological changes that can happen in the brain, of which I didn't know, of which you can turn back, but I didn't know any of this. So I kind of sat there for a while, Lorraine, thinking, where's my knight in shining armor going to come and charge in and scoop me up and rescue me? And I waited and I waited and sadly nobody came. And I actually remember it was in 2013. That was kind of a pivotal year for me. So I hit 40 that year. And also I had my family home repossessed as well. So it was almost like, what else is going to happen now? I have nothing, you know. Literally I was running a clinic part-time because of the children and childcare, and the money going out didn't equal the money coming in, and I'd be putting £10 petrol in my car because I didn't know whether I'd need any money the next day, and I was literally living hand to mouth and, you know, worried about how I was going to pay my bills, but knowing if I worked more then I'd have childcare costs. And I felt really trapped as such with where I was. And really for me, when my house was repossessed, then I remember almost it being a fork in the road, thinking, is this how my life is now going to be forevermore? Or am I going to do something about it? Am I going to stop sitting in my own pity party, feeling like this victim and living my life like that, being angry at everybody else for my life being like this? Or am I going to do something about it? And that's really where my own self-healing journey started, and really my obsession a little bit really with trauma, what goes on in the brain and the body. So over those years that have got me to where I am now. In 2013, I actually started a home-based business a network marketing business, which I'm sure people will have many negative thoughts about network marketing, but actually it was a real savior for me at the time. I didn't know it was a network marketing business, but within 6 months I was earning a 6-figure income from that network marketing business. I was one of the top business builders in the UK in that company. And, you know, for 3 years I worked really hard, and I was qualifying for holidays, checks, paid off all my debt, loved the personal development aspect of doing that business. And what I found was that what I loved the most was actually helping people with their own issues, their own problems. And so really that's when I started thinking, okay, you know, how can I use this, my own experiences, my own knowledge, and then kind of learn more about that. So, you know, over the years now, you know, the qualifications that I've got, I was one of the very first UK accredited divorce and breakup coaches. So that was sort of a number of years ago. Also, I'm just in the final part of my master's now in applied positive psychology and coaching psychology. So again, very much about future focus, living your best life, getting to your next level as well. Last year I flew to San Diego. I don't know whether anyone's heard of a man called Brendan Burchard. He's probably the most, you know, top rated high performance coach in the world. So every year he trains about 120 people to become a certified high performance coach. So I trained in that last year over in San Diego. And from a coaching perspective, I kind of do the positive psychology coaching, high performance, and then obviously the coaching psychology aspect of all of this. And then from the therapy aspect, so I'm qualified in EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's one of the best treatments for trauma. Also recently qualified in something called brain spotting, which is probably an even deeper version of EMDR, actually. It's amazing. And also rapid transformational therapy. So I use a lot of integrations in what I do, from therapy to coaching, really, again, using me as my own model as such, with the things as I was learning and growing, thinking, okay, this bit I need help on now. How do I do that? What do I do? So I've kind of amalgamated a business now, and over the last sort of 3 years with that, I've won multiple awards now. I've written a best-selling book. I now have a multiple 6-figure income coaching and therapy business, pretty much building my whole business online as well. So I do have clients I see face to face if they live locally, but pretty much I have an international now base of clients all over the world. I've been able to enroll my children in private school now that I solely pay for. So I'm totally, more or less, other than what my ex-husband has to give me, financially responsible for my children. And you know, I have to pinch myself almost with what I do. Doesn't feel like work. It feels very personal to me to try and help people with their own past traumas. So although I kind of specialize in that sort of psychological narcissistic abuse area, a lot of it is around childhood trauma, attachment focused, psychological abuse. So again, helping people clear their past and their subconscious beliefs to go on really to live their best life, because they deserve to, and people just get so stuck. So it's a lot of psych education in what I do as well.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Caroline. That was an amazing sort of outlook at kind of what you've been through and how you've turned that trauma, and you use that line, don't you, turning trauma into transformation. And you know, it's an amazing journey. And you know, there's a lot of relation in there to kind of my life too, and hence why we connected in the first place. And I think one of those terms kind of used around narcissism, it doesn't get its best press. It's not really well recognized in the court and all those kind of things, and it's very difficult to prove. You know, and you know, one of the things that I'm really passionate about is really helping people that have suffered similar. And I think sort of going back to your story and other people that do coaching, one of the things that I find is when you've been through the experience yourself, you're in such a better position to be able to understand your client and therefore offer the right treatment. And like you, the journey of understanding the therapies that are out there and practicing and learning yourself and going through that experience, you're able to know what's best for your clients. So thank you for sharing that. So has anyone in the room got any questions for Caroline? And we can kind of expand on other questions as well. For anyone that's watching on Facebook, Caroline is here today talking about what she does to help people to turn that trauma into transformation through a different range of integrative solutions. Positive psychology is up and coming. It's really kind of out there now, and you know, if you haven't looked at it, there's some amazing books called Positivity and Flourish, you know, so they can kind of get the wheels in motion. But anyone that's in the room, do you have any questions for Caroline? You've all gone silence.
I think one of the things to talk about here as well is what exactly trauma is as well, because I think people have a real misunderstanding in some respects about trauma, which then sometimes leaves people almost feeling a lot of guilt and shame and anger about where they're stuck at in the present day, because they don't almost think they've suffered trauma, because a lot of the time we think trauma of maybe being in a car accident or a soldier going out to Afghanistan or something like that, and actually trauma is overwhelm to your system. And you know, if you imagine that we all have a certain capacity to cope with things, almost like a swimming pool, say, and from birth onwards we have stresses obviously in our life, and that can come of big stresses in our childhood, if there's neglect or abuse. Equally, it can be just our interpretation of things, of how our parents are, maybe they're more emotionally unavailable. So if you imagine your capacity is like a swimming pool of how you cope with things, and all of these stresses are like beach balls coming into this swimming pool. And over time, obviously, if you've only got a certain capacity and you've got lots of beach balls coming in, at some stage that is going to overflow and it's going to be overwhelmed to your system. And this is why in society today, people can be quite judgmental about how people cope with things. I wouldn't cope with it like that. I do this, I do that. And I know I had people say that to me when things obviously broke down in my marriage. Oh, you know, if that had happened to me, I'd have done this to him, I'd have done that to him and everything else. And, you know, I just wasn't in that headspace at that time anyway, because my capacity was so overflowing. You know, my mum had passed away. I'd been in that abusive relationship for sort of 12 years as well. So I think as a society, trauma is trauma to you. It is overwhelmed to your system, and how one person may cope with that is completely different to somebody else, because we don't know what the size of their swimming pool is, and we don't know how many beach balls they've already got in there. And it could be just one more beach ball that sends somebody over the edge, for instance, and somebody else might have something that happens to them and they've got not many beach balls in there, so they have a larger capacity to be able to cope with that. So again, a lot of the work I do is kind of increasing the capacity of their swimming pool so they can cope better, and diving in and getting all those beach balls out as well. So we're processing that trauma. So I think from that trauma perspective, it's really helping people recognize it's very personal to you. And if you've got blocks in your life and you know you're not reaching where you need to be, very often it will be a trauma perspective. And I would hazard a guess pretty much every single person watching, listening will have had some trauma in their life. Maybe not the trauma they think that it might be, but we will all have had trauma.
Yeah. And the thing that come apparent to me actually was, you know, it was the difficulty getting out of the relationship, but actually the trauma hit me after.
Yeah.
You know, so I thought that I had the freedom and I thought that everything would just get better.
Yeah.
But actually then it felt like I'd been hit by a bus.
Right. You're dealing with so many things then. You're dealing with actually realizing maybe what the relationship was like in that scenario, and also the actual practical aspect of everything, the legal aspect, which, as you mentioned, you know, sadly our court system is very broken, not just in the UK but around the world when it comes to things like psychological abuse, because just as you said, Lorraine, it's one person's word often against the other, because they're very different in public than they are behind closed doors.
And the thing is, you can't physically see it because it's an internal,
Right. And often how you would come across, and again, this is where people don't understand trauma. You know, I always use this, and I always use my little ladder and stuff. You know, if you're at the bottom of your ladder, sort of suffering with, you know, you're in freeze and you are maybe dissociative, which is kind of numbing out to something. Sometimes that can look like you don't care, or, you know, because you're not crying necessarily, but actually it's because you're in a very dissociative state. You're right at the bottom of your emotional regulation ladder in freeze trauma response. So if you are in court, for instance, in that, it looks like, well, it can't be that bad then, you're not crying, you're not this or anything, but actually it's because you are in a trauma response. And sadly, again, you know, and I know the new domestic abuse bill, fingers crossed, is coming through, and there's a lot of changes hopefully coming afoot. But again, people don't understand trauma. They don't understand how people react and how they behave from a trauma response in certain situations as well. So, you know, I think that that's something, again, from a global perspective, that people need to understand that.
And I think one of the other things, and, you know, this is going back to my own personal journey, but just kind of just to help in this arena, you show up in the world as everything is okay. Yeah. So you put on a mask, you put on a facade, and you go about your day, you go into work, whatever it is, and everyone sees you as everything is okay. And it's only when you go back at home and you're, you know, in that situation, and you have that feeling of, is it me?
Correct. Because to find yourself in a relationship like that, there will have been preceding factors that would have led you to be in that relationship, and actually they're just shining a great big spotlight on a lot of deep inner child wounds that you already have. They're just really picking the scabs off them and really making them bleed for you as well. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We put on this facade going out. I know I did. You know, if someone said, "How are you?" I'd be like, "Yeah, I'm fine." You know, like we all do. You know, that really good sentence, "I'm fine." And everything, you know, it's got a multitude of meanings, hasn't it, really? Normally not that you are fine. And so you're right, we hide behind that, because again, our society, the way that it's set up very often, is that if we look like we are not coping, so to speak, we're weak. And it absolutely isn't that we're weak. We are in trauma responses with regards, and again, how we respond to things is very much about, it's not events that make us feel the way we do. So again, trauma, psychological abuse, narcissistic abuse, it is a mind, brain and body experience. And it's really important for people to recognize it's really what goes on in your body, in your nervous system. That's what we're feeling all the time, you know, rapid heart racing, clenching our fists. All of these things are trauma responses. It's our body's perception that we are in danger, and then we react in a fight, flight and freeze. Or also from an abusive relationship, we can also have a fourth trauma response, which is called fawn or appease, where we try and do everything right to the abuser so that they maybe don't act as abusive towards you as well. So that's a fourth trauma response that we bring in when we're talking sort of from an abusive relationship perspective as well. So, you know, but it's not these events that cause us to feel the way that we do. It's what we're saying to ourselves. So, you know, if you're in an abusive relationship and you're out of that relationship, in theory, you are now safe, so to speak. However, your brain is still stuck that, and this is when we get trapped trauma in our body, because every time something happens, we feel a certain way. Now, it's not those events that are causing you to feel like that. It's those negative cognitions. It's what you're saying to yourself. So I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. I'm not important. I'm unlovable. That's what causes the dysregulation. But with that then means we hold the power with that, because if we go in and heal that wound, regardless then of how anybody else is, we're not going to feel that reaction in our nervous system to all of those things as well. And, you know, key for me in doing sort of the EMDR and the brain spotting was what I realized when I was treating my clients was that no matter how much I worked on subconscious beliefs and, you know, that cognitive aspect of therapy, in those present moments, if we hadn't cleared that trauma out of their body, they would still have a reaction to things. So EMDR and brain spotting are what we call a brain body based somatic psychotherapy. So it's very much about, you know, talking therapy is great, but it's only in this part of the brain. It's sort of the 10% part of our brain. So no matter how much someone might say, I am safe now, I am lovable, I am good enough, that's only in 10%. It's in our higher brain. This is where trauma is processed. So if we're not actually working with people at this aspect of their brain, doesn't matter how much talking therapy we do with them, if we don't process that trauma, it's always still going to keep on coming up and triggered as well. So really it's a real holistic, whole person approach with all of this, so that we're working with each individual person at all different levels for them, you know, so that cognitively they obviously can help process this, but also where trauma is processed in the limbic system and down into the brainstem in the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. That's the part that we really want to be working on as well, so that they can actually move forward without reacting to things in the present as if they were back in those events in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally get that, because again, you know, it's, you know, there is definitely this whole ethos around, you know, do positive affirmations every day, and it has its workability and it's good. Yeah, but like you said, when something is deep. Yeah.
And I think again, affirmations are brilliant. I do affirmations and they're fantastic. And, you know, certainly, you know, we're not saying don't do that, because everything has a place, everything. But the key thing to recognize here is, if people just do affirmations or just do talking therapy, and then they're kind of thinking, why am I still feeling that something isn't right? Very often then we start to think that it's us. Is there something wrong with me? You know, am I weak? Am I just not able to move forward? And it isn't, because it physiologically, trauma can get stuck in our body, and we call it somatic memory. And I always say it's like little landmines in your body, really, that lay quite dormant, but when you get a trigger, and that could be a smell, a sound, the way someone looks at you, a message that you get from somebody, and all of a sudden it's like these little landmines are going off in your body, and you kind of think, oh my God, you know, you might start shaking. You know, I know when my ex-husband used to pick up the children right at the start, I'd be physically shaking after he'd gone, and this was my body going into a trauma response. No matter how much I kept saying to myself, you know, I'm okay, my body was telling a different story, you know. And there's a great book by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps Score. It's a brilliant book, and your body often will tell the story before you say anything. You will feel it in your body. And again, you know, disease and illness that we have in society today, you know, over 80% is caused by stress, as really being in these trauma responses far longer than we should be, even though the danger has already gone. But we get stuck in those responses, and that has a knock-on effect on our health.
Absolutely. So we have a question on Facebook. Anyone in the room got any questions? Okay, Raj. Oh, take you off mute even.
I was muted, sorry. So I think it was a very inspiring story. So Caroline, you mentioned about NDR and brain spotting. Can you please highlight?
What they are? Okay, so both of them are really looking at eye movements in some level. So EMDR, which like I said is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, bit of a mouthful, and although it's called eye movement, actually it's to do with bilateral stimulation. So we're basically with EMDR using the right and left hemispheres of our brain to process stuck trauma. So if you imagine we're in our brain, so normally when we're operating on a day-to-day basis, we're normally in what we call the front part of our brain, our prefrontal cortex, okay? This is our logical, rational language center of our brain. Now, when we get a trigger, okay, we then go into the emotional part of our brain, which is called the limbic system. Now, there's two key elements in here. One is called the hippocampus and one is the amygdala. Now, the hippocampus is our memory center, and that's really what timestamps events as we're going through our life into the past, so that every day we can wake up and we know that happened yesterday or last year or 10 years ago, so that we can function on a day-to-day basis. And that then with the amygdala, which is our fear center, will send messages to our nervous system to react in a fight, flight or freeze if need be, you know. So but what can happen is when trauma gets stuck, Raj, if you imagine that's the hippocampus, it's like those memories are still live. So when things happen in the present, it sends a message to the amygdala, go into fight, flight or freeze still, because it's still live almost. It hasn't been time stamped into the past. So we still feel things as if you were back in there. Now what EMDR does with using bilateral stimulation, so that can be eye movement. So again, if I'm in person, I'll use my fingers, or if it's online, I have a special eye tool. It can be using tapping. I've got some TheraTappers that we use. So it's not like EFT with the tapping, it's actually using bilateral stimulation. And what happens by using that bilateral stimulation is we're making ourselves, every time we're thinking about these things, coming back into our prefrontal cortex. And we have something in EMDR called the adaptive information processing. So it allows us to process those memories, to get the hippocampus basically to timestamp them. Now, I also do something called Flash EMDR, which Flash EMDR allows us to process without actually thinking of the traumatic event as well. So we think of something really positive, and often I will use music with my clients, and we'll have put, say, the traumatic memory in like a book at the side, and it's like, don't think about it, so to speak. So we're then focusing on music, or we can talk, or a comedy. Sometimes I bring up a YouTube comedian or something that we're really focused on. So although I'm telling my client, don't think about the trauma, the brain is still working really hard in the background. But the beauty of using Flash EMDR is it's working hard in the background to process it, but it's not activating the amygdala, which sends the message to the nervous system to react. So we're able to process it without actually thinking of the traumatic event, which I think is great, because so many people know they've got past trauma, but they get really worried about thinking, I don't want to open that Pandora's box up because I don't know where it's going to go. So Flash EMDR is great. Brain spotting, again, we're looking at this part of the brain where trauma is processed. And with brain spotting, really the ethos behind that is where we look affects how we feel. So when I'm talking to my clients, I'm watching where they're looking when they're talking about various traumas, for instance. Very often they're doing this unconsciously. People aren't aware of it. And when I do a brain spotting online, and I'll use this in person or online, basically what I'll do is when they're thinking about that traumatic memory, I will find the spot where it feels even more in their body. They feel a spike of that. So let's say if somebody has a trauma and it's a 7 out of 10 when they're thinking about it, as I move my pointer around in a certain way in the session, there'll be one particular spot, and it's amazing how it works, where they kind of go, oh yeah, there. And that might be looking up to the right, for instance. So I will have my pointer going up there, and so for the session they will keep looking at the pointer. I will use bilateral music in their ears again, because I want to keep the processing in this part of the brain. Don't want it to be here. That's not where trauma is processed. It's here. And actually brain spotting really uses our own brain's natural healing, because our brain wants to heal, our brain wants to regulate ourselves, and it just allows, in that safe relationship with me and my client, to process naturally that trauma. And it's incredible. You know, I had a client the other week who, you know, had horrific childhood trauma and was bulimic and being sick maybe 4 or 5 times a day, and we had one brain spotting session, and you know, she's gone down to being sick now about every 4 to 5 days, just once now, and that was just one session. So you know, these are brain body based therapies, so it's really about how you feel in your body. Both of them, both EMDR and brain spotting, both have a great place in all of that, and again, I use both with my clients, and it really can be so transformational for them. Whereas, you know, before they'd have tried lots of other things, but just seeing that shift. And once the hippocampus as well as timestamp that memory, no matter how hard you then try and bring up the feelings of that trauma, you've adapted, that your brain has processed it. And so that doesn't mean we've kind of waved a magic wand and everything in your past hasn't happened. What it means is we now in the present don't feel that 8, 9, 10 out of 10 reaction in our body. We've processed it, time-stamped it, so we can think about it without all of that dysregulation in our body.
That sounds absolutely amazing.
They're both great therapies. They're fantastic. They really are.
Does that answer your question, Raj?
Absolutely. I had a personal experience which I'll tell later. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, excellent. Brilliant. Brilliant. Oh, I'm so pleased.
So let's just go to Facebook. This question here, it's quite long-winded. It says narcissistic behavior is so damaging, but the term has been misused and people don't always realize this. Do you think that topics such as narcissistic behavior, trauma, etc., should be part of the school teachings?
Yeah, absolutely. Not necessarily talking about, narcissism as such, but I think from a school perspective, talking about what is a healthy relationship is really, really important. And I know they touch on things now in school. They've got PHSE and things like this, and I know it's way better than even it was. But I think the key to this from a psychological abuse perspective is we talk a lot in school about bullying, and that can often be bullying from a verbal capacity. But I think we need to take that further as such when we talk about bullying in school, and talk about bullying as adults, so to speak, and then tie that into the psychological aspect of it. And also teaching our younger generation to trust their gut. If your gut is telling and you're feeling something, to listen to it. That's telling you something, because our body is a beautiful machine designed to keep us safe and protect us. So if we're starting to feel something in our gut, which is the second brain, to listen to that as well. And I, again, talking about the sort of narcissistic abuse aspect, again, in the court system or school, I'm not one for labels as such, but I think in certain scenarios it's really important for us to have labels with some things, because we can gain more of an understanding with all of that as well. But at the end of the day, whatever label we decide to put on anything, it's about human behavior. It's about how you feel. And if you feel something isn't right, I will get so many messages going, is my ex a narcissist? Is my mother a narcissist? Is my father a narcissist? And of course, I can't diagnose that. I don't know, because I'm not the one living through it. But what I do say is, okay, let's forget about them for a moment. Tell me how you feel. Tell me what is coming up for you, because regardless of whether they're a narcissist or not, if you know something isn't right and you are feeling every day waking up with dread and tension, your health is suffering, regardless of whether they're a narcissist or not, that's not how you should be living your life. So yes, it's good to have some labels to gain an understanding so you know it's not you. But equally, this is your life. And at the end of the day, going back to the school aspect, I think it's important that we instill confidence in our children and also a healthy sense of self. So a lot of the work I do is on parts therapy and talking about codependency and that healthy sense of self. And very often in school, it's so academic focused, it's almost like you get praise if you get, a great mark at what you do. And I know schools are better, and I don't want to kind of, put all the schools in the same boat with this. But a lot of it becomes conditional, and again, when I teach my clients, when they've got children, the sort of positive conscious parenting aspect of this, it's really stripping back that when you're with your children, if they're getting great exam results or marks or anything, don't focus on the mark, focus on the effort they did to get the mark. We really want to focus on them, not any results, regardless of what the mark is, so to speak. Because if they're only getting love and praise when they get a result, so to speak, then that's going to, and I know this, that's going to set yourself up for perfectionism, high achieving, which again can have a positive outlook for yourself, but it will make you ill. And I know that from personal experience, because I used to be such a perfectionist and a high achiever, because of course my deep inner wound was I'm not good enough. So the more high achieving and perfect I could be in every single thing I did, it was less likely that wound was going to get aggravated. But equally, that then made me a magnet to a narcissist as well. So, that there are payoffs to things, sometimes positive, but at the end of the day, this is about you living your life, with more balance, more connection, love, joy, happiness. And, that's something that, I'm really passionate about.
I hear you. And the thing is around that whole word of perfectionism as well is, people put off things because of the fear of failure, because they only want to be a success. And so because they have this perfectionism about them, that whole procrastination kicks in.
It does. And these are protector parts. I use a parts therapy called internal family systems with what I do. And procrastination, perfectionism, self-sabotage, all of these are what we call a proactive protector part. So our brain's number one job is to keep us safe and to move us away from pain. So very often if someone's sitting in a place of procrastination, and that could be in their personal life or in their business as well, that procrastination is actually a protector part for them, because they'll have a wound, and we call this an exile in internal family systems. So that protector part basically is saying, hey, I know you're in pain right now, and I know it's not good because you're procrastinating, but my fear is if I don't stop you from doing something, then if you step into that, that's going to aggravate the wound. So these are all protector parts. So again, a lot of the work I do is conversing with different parts of us, giving them different roles, because we don't want them to stop you doing that. We want you to be successful in your life. But also, again, going back to that wound, we're going back all the time to that inner child, younger wound, carrying the burden of, what happens in our childhood. And when I say childhood, I had a good childhood. It wasn't that I didn't have a good childhood. So it doesn't mean that you've had neglect or abuse in your childhood for this. My interpretation of my dad being quite unemotional as such was, I'm not good enough. I do bits of gymnastics in the lounge, and my dad would be the judge, and he'd be kind of 9.99 recurring. And of course, I can laugh about that as an adult, but that had a really profound impact on me as a child, with other things that happened as well, with my reports and everything else, that my interpretation of that was, hey, my dad's not kind of saying 10 out of 10, or he's not saying well done, or I'm proud of you. So my interpretation of that as a child was, I can't be good enough. As an adult, of course, cognitively, I know, okay, my dad had quite an unemotional childhood, so he was parenting to his capacity that he could parent, to his capability. But I didn't know that as a child. I just thought, why is my dad not saying all of this stuff? So again, a lot of the work I do goes back to childhood and that attachment-focused aspect of it, because a lot of the stuff goes back to that, and that doesn't mean you had a bad childhood. It just means wounds will have formed because of your interpretation of things.
Yeah, I absolutely get that, because I think, I use the word condition, I think, as well sometimes, where, through our parenting, through our education, through society, through work, through bosses we've had, you kind of have this conditioning as to what is really right, and how I should be and how I should show up. And, going back to kind of the school side of things, we have to be good at maths, we have to be good at English, we have to be good at science, and not everyone is built that way. There's a lot of children that are more artistic and more musical, and so one of the things that I like to encourage with younger people is to say, do you know what? Focus on what you love and do more of it and become an expert, rather than struggling. Right. Yes, we do need maths and English, generally, but actually focus on something you're really good at as well, so that it takes away the pressure.
It is, and that's a very positive psychology way of looking at it as well. We focus on the strengths, because again, very often in school, the things you're bad at school, that's what they focus on. But if you're really good at something else, well, hey, what if we focused on that? Imagine if you're really good at something here, but you're not so good at something here. Well, yeah, we could maybe make that better. But actually, what if we really focused on what you were really good at? Because your whole demeanor and manner would change, because you're focusing on something you're really good at, and it's just fulfilling you with all of that from a strengths perspective as well.
And because you've got that feeling inside, it enables the other things to come as well, because you're in a much better place from a psychological perspective. There's another question that's come through that says here, it all sounds really fascinating, especially the work around sort of children. Do you do any particular work with children around sexual abuse? And this person had done some SCARS training, I don't know if you're familiar with that, which educates people about child sexual abuse and how to spot it. But it's left worrying about how these poor children are helped to recover from it, if even they are. Yeah. Do you know
So yes, they can recover from it, and I think that's the key thing. It depends what age. You know, I work a lot with, I have got some clients that are children, they're more teenagers as such, but a lot of my clients, the adult clients, there are sexual abuse, child abuse from obviously when they were younger, and absolutely we can work on that. I think maybe the question that they are saying is obviously from a safeguarding perspective of things to look out for, and that will come from the schools and, you know, from a parent perspective, looking out for things. Very often as well, when children will say they've got tummy ache, or obviously it can be a tummy ache, but with your children, really look out for signs. A child will really struggle sometimes to actually verbally say things, you know, particularly if there's abuse involved, because the abuser may be saying, you know, don't say anything, you know, it's our little secret, you know, all of the things like that. But a child will have other ways maybe of showing that, you know, and that could potentially come out with, you know, I've got tummy ache. So that they're giving you sometimes signs as such, but in a physical way. The other thing that I do with my clients, and this isn't necessarily from a sexual abuse perspective, but if children are going and spending time with their abusive ex-husband or ex-wife as such as well, very often, again, if you say to a child, don't say anything, children will take things really literally with that. So I will often say, you know, get them to draw things, get them to paint things, use a sand tray, you know, get them their Lego figures or their Playmobil figures and get them to act things out as such. So you know, if you've told a child not to say anything, they won't say anything, but they might draw it. You know, they might mess around in the sand with it, so to speak. So, you know, it's just being aware. But from children's perspective, we can do EMDR on children. We can do brain spotting on a child as well. It is adapted for that as well, because obviously depending on the ages, you know, my teenage clients, I use brain spotting, I use EMDR and rapid transformational therapy as well. So I use all of those with children, but very much adapted and everything. A lot of it is about the relationship you have with the child, with the client as well, because, you know, to heal, you need to feel safe in a relationship, and if someone's been abused and has come out of that, they're going to see people as dangerous. You know, people equals danger to them. So it's really about building that trust and that relationship to start off with, so they feel safe enough to come into this part of their brain as well, to then start to process some of that as well. But certainly, you know, and again, trauma, whatever trauma you've had in the past, you know, there are ways through all of this as well. You know, even if you've got a 10 out of 10 with how you feel, say, with disturbance and distress in your body, imagine if it was 5 out of 10. So even half of what you are feeling. So there's so much that we can do now. There's so much research coming through. Sadly, a lot of med schools and that don't do a lot of this brain body based therapy work. You know, I've got a client who's a psychiatrist. I've got 3 clients who are psychologists. They don't get taught any of this stuff. They don't get taught these types of therapies. And yet things like polyvagal theory is how our system reacts to trauma, you know, what our nervous system does. They don't get taught any of that in med school at all, yet that is actually the crux of this. And I remember you know, one of my clients who was a psychiatrist, and she was like, oh my God, it makes so much sense. Why are we not taught this? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. Because once you know this stuff about yourself, you can't unknow it. And then you actually understand why you're reacting. So I'm not weak then by not recovering. So I'm not weak when I don't want to get out of bed. I'm just in a freeze trauma response because my body is feeling everything's dangerous. It's like, yeah. And they're like, oh, and it's like this big relief for them, recognizing that actually everything for them is purely about safety and moving away from pain. And when they get that, it's like, so if I just understand what my version of danger is and what my wound is and work on that, it can change. Yes, it can. And it's just like these light bulbs going off because they suddenly see a light at the end of that tunnel rather than this big dark tunnel with this is how I'm going to live for the rest of my life, which is where I was and everything. I just thought, is this it? Is this my life now? You know, this is great. And again, because I was 40 in that year where things changed, I thought, well, you know, I've had some good years and everything. I was almost thinking that that was the end of my life, and it was just downhill from there. Oh, you know, so I'm really passionate about people, whatever your age. My dad's 79 now, and, you know, my mum passed away 11 years ago. He's been dating for 18 months now. He's really happy. So, you know, regardless, whatever your age, it doesn't have to carry on being like that.
Yeah, definitely. It's choosing the lens sometimes, isn't it? You know, we you know, as humans, we are more negative bias, aren't we? Because that's, if you think about our brain and the mind, you know, and that survival part, we're going to be looking for, yeah, how danger shows up and keeping us protected. And it's so much stronger than, you know, our positive side. So we've got to work hard, you know, and it's tiring. And when we're constantly in, I'll call it adversity, when we're constantly in that struggle or challenge, that takes so much over, then it's difficult. You know, if you're having that day after day after day over a long period of time, you know, I use the hippo time. You know, sometimes you just need to be on the sofa with a duvet and watch some.
Absolutely, and there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely, I put a post in my group this morning, you know, saying self-care is not selfish; it's a necessity, and it really is. You know, this is our vessel, this is our body. You know, this is, you know, not a dress rehearsal, that this is our life. And, you know, but awareness is key with all of this. Awareness is really the first starting point to heal, and it takes practice and daily intention to do that. And sometimes it's hard and you do want to crawl away, and sometimes you do have to do that. It's really about listening to your body, and getting that right support and help with how to heal as well.
Yeah. Just had a question come in on the chat. Which therapy would you suggest for 16 years of abuse from 2 different ex-partners?
Oh, well, firstly, I'm so sorry you've had to go through all of that for 16 years as well. And really, again, some of the things that I've talked about, you being in that abusive relationships for 16 years, they've highlighted an inner wound that you had even preceding being in those relationships. So for us to not find ourselves in that situation again, we need to go within and heal that wound. So again, combination of things there that I would suggest would be things like EMDR or brain spotting, or a combination of both, because there's clearly something stuck there belief-wise, and maybe some negative cognitions about yourself in all of this, and we can get stuck. We keep attracting the same thing into our life. We're focusing on all the things we don't want, and actually what we want to do is focus on the things we do. But when we're dealing with a wound, as such, everything becomes for you protecting that wound. So what I would say there is that there's obviously a deep inner wound there that we need to work on. And certainly from my perspective, you know, if you were my client, then I would always suggest sort of a 6-session package with me. That incorporates therapy and coaching, depending on what comes up. Sometimes it can be 6 sessions of therapy, because, you know, we never know how deep things are going to go with all of that. But certainly the starting point would be psych education about why you are feeling the way you do. So I teach all my clients polyvagal theory, which sounds very sciencey, but it's actually very interesting, but I think really imperative for people to understand why they are where they are, because then that gives them that awareness as a starting point. And then I would be doing a combination of EMDR and brain spotting, probably do an RTT session, so we've got a recording to really help upgrade those beliefs about yourself as well, and then bringing in some high performance and positive psychology coaching so that we can really move you forward with all of that. Now, you know, that may not take 6 sessions, it might take 12 sessions. Again, everybody is different, but what I would say is, with regards to all of that, is 16 years is a long time. Maybe it's your time now, maybe it's your time. They have just highlighted some wounds. And I always said, you know, I spent so long being really angry at my ex-husband, but actually I see it as a real gift now. He highlighted the stuff that was already my wounds anyway, and he highlighted that very deeply, that I needed to go in and heal all of that. And, you know, my ex-husband hasn't changed, but I've healed my wound of not being good enough now. So regardless of what he says or does or anything, it doesn't trigger me. And I'm remarried now as well. So, you know, there is life beyond all of that. And in positive psychology as well, we have something called post-traumatic growth. So growth because of the traumas that you have been through. So I know my life now is far more joyful, far more connected, you know, far happier because of the trauma I'd been through. Not because I wouldn't have had an all right life beforehand. I would have been okay, but I have a much deeper meaning to my life now, and I would never have had that had I not had those traumas that I went through. So although obviously at the time you think, oh my God, I don't want to be here, actually now I think, wow, that gave me the opportunity to really go within and heal. So really a combination. I always use an integration of stuff, and that is very intuitive with my clients when I start building the relationship with them. So there's no, right, we're going to do this. It's very intuitive once I start building that relationship with my client of what I feel will be the most benefit for them.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. One of the other things, Caroline, just to kind of touch on, was that when you have been through significant trauma for a serious amount of time, the other thing that happens, not for everyone, but a lot of people that I talk to, is they lose their identity. They lose who they really are. They've forgotten, you know, if you go back to that child, you know, and then all of those conditions and all the trauma on top, they lose their identity. Would you say that there's a process or a therapy, or, you know, how would you help someone in that particular
so that goes back to the parts therapy again. So they've not lost their identity. What they've got are very strong protector parts that almost look like that false sense of self, that ego, that false sense of self operating in their life. You know, remember, everything is about protection and keeping safe. So when you think about I've lost who I am, no, you haven't. There's still you at the core of all of that. There's still the self. But what the self has are then these wounds, and those wounds then have these protector parts coming up to protect the wounds. So it almost looks like you've lost the self, so to speak. You haven't. You've just got these strong protector parts really trying to deviate, soothe, distract you away from pain. So all things like addictions, you know, things like overeating, drinking too much, promiscuity, dissociation, all of these are protector parts of a wound. They're to distract away from a deep inner wound. So again, it's not that you've lost who you are, so to speak. It's just you've got very strong protector parts. So for things like this, again, I will often in my sessions, we'll kind of have a pretend table, and we'll get these parts around the table. You know, you'll have the self as the leader in all of this. You'll have the wound. We even name them as well. And we have them around the table. And sometimes as well, from an EMDR and brain spotting perspective, we work on those parts as well, because those parts, we don't necessarily want them there because they are almost stopping us living our life, but they think they're doing us a favor. They think they're protecting us, and they don't want to go away. So we've got to befriend those parts, give them a different role, and work on the wound. Because if the wound then, let's say you have a wound of I'm not good enough, just using me as an example, you know, that came from my childhood. You know, what child do we know that isn't good enough? Of course they are. Again, it was my perception and my interpretation. So if I work on that wound and really start to heal that wound, then those protector parts don't really have a wound to protect, but they're not going anywhere. They're still part of us. We all have these sub-personalities within us. We just give them a different role, you know, maybe a role to support you in eating more healthily, or support you in doing more exercise and stuff. So we really have to shift those roles and work on that wound. But you haven't lost who you are. Everybody at the core of us, really, unless we're a psychopath or sociopath born like that, everybody, even a narcissist, has a self that is kind, compassionate, caring. Now, again, people might be listening thinking, no, my narcissist isn't like that. Well, they just have extremely strong protector parts. And again, there's no research out there at all to suggest we can ever cure narcissistic personality disorder. And that's not because I wouldn't necessarily want to help a narcissist heal. I would. But a narcissist won't ever recognize there's something wrong in the first place. So they're always projecting outwards. So it's not a case of me not wanting. And actually, a narcissist comes about from childhood trauma, and that can be from neglect or golden child, siblings against each other, or abuse. and they have just got such strong protector parts as a narcissist, you're never going to see the true self ever. So that's what makes it really difficult with regards to narcissistic personality disorder, is there's no way of getting beyond all of that. There's such strong parts that's who you see. So I know when I think about my ex-husband, I actually feel incredibly sorry for him in some respects, because, you know, there are deep wounds, so to speak, and that's created the narcissistic personality disorder for him. But he is a codependent as well. So, you know, codependents are magnets to narcissists, but narcissists are also codependent. However, codependents recognize that there's an issue, whereas narcissists don't. Both have deep inner wounds. Codependent recognizes and wants to heal, the narcissist doesn't. Therein lies the problem, so to speak. So no matter how much I'd want my ex to recognize and talk and this and co-parent and that, I couldn't do that, not because I wasn't prepared to, he wasn't prepared to. There was that barrier to all of that as well, and that's what makes it very challenging.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Caroline. I'm kind of conscious of time. There's actually a couple of questions on Facebook, so it might be that we go back over those at some point. But one of the questions is around bullying, and the other one is about contact with their ex, that they've obviously, you know, how do they avoid that? So it might be, if you could just maybe have a look at those, that would be fantastic. Yeah. So, Raj, did you have a quick question? I'm kind of mindful that we need to wrap it up in a minute.
Just 10 seconds. How different is it to handle professional trauma when you compare it with personal trauma? I was a naval officer, so our pressures were completely different. And how different is that?
Okay, so I would say I would handle it exactly the same way, because even in that professional perspective, remember, it's not events that cause you to feel the way you do in that environment. It's what you're saying to yourself. So working on what, you know, say if you had a professional trauma with regards to that, from an EMDR perspective, I say, well, okay, these things happening to you as such, what does that say about you? What negative belief are you saying to yourself about why this is happening in that moment? That's what we work on. And it would be exactly the same regardless of what it was, so to speak, because it's what you are saying to yourself that causes the dysregulation. So whether it be personal or professional, it's still what you are saying to yourself, and that comes from somewhere. So very often, if for instance, on your perspective, Raj, if it was something from that professional aspect, and we found out it was, you know, these things happening to me made me think I wasn't good enough in this scenario, or I'm not worthy, okay? So what I would do then is I'd do what we call float back, and I'd float back and say, okay, all of these feelings that you feel around this with I'm not worthy, maybe you can feel it in your stomach, maybe, you know, you feel like your hands are like this, float back to a time when you felt like that as well. And we keep going back and back, and then we work on the earliest one, and then we come back again to the present day, because it will be what we call these feeder memories. So if you imagine the event maybe is the professional aspect, so to speak, is like the leaves on a tree, and we want to go back to the seed and then come back to the present day as well, to make sure we've really processed and cleared any trauma that you have as well. So we're really working all the way back as far as we can go, and then coming back up again, just to make sure it's all cleared, because memories aren't necessarily linear. You know, there are offshoots to all of these as well, and it's about, again, your brain processing all of that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much to Caroline for this absolutely amazing session. It's been a wealth of information, and I hope everyone has enjoyed the experience and had their questions answered. If you need to get in touch with Caroline, do check out Caroline. Just remind me of your website address. Is it Caroline?
Easy, carolinestrawson.com, or you can pop me a message on Facebook or Instagram. So yeah, everything's Caroline Strawson. So just wherever you want to find me or send me a message or anything, please do so.
And Caroline has some amazing videos on a YouTube channel, and she's got an amazing Facebook group with a load of people in there that are either dealing with similar situations, and you know, it's a great community as well. So do check out Caroline's work. I'm very keen to carry on following, because I'm amazed at what this woman has achieved in such a short space of time, considering what you've been through. So you're an inspirational woman in my world. And if I can follow that path, I certainly will, because I love your work.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that.
So thank you, and thank you to everyone else. And I shall see you again on our Ask the Expert when we return after the summer holidays. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Lorraine.
Take care. Thanks for listening.
Very much.
Bye.
Bye.